One regret I have, I think, about my collegiate years and early professional career, I guess, is not, considering other fields even. I basically was so intrigued by the human system and the human body, which I fell into something that I ultimately am very interested in love. But I think I had a lot of influencers who were also in that space, and it kind of created a vacuum chamber, for better or for worse. Be open to, taking non-traditional paths or non-traditional roles that, maybe you can't see the direct connection. Maybe you want to be an elite sport, but honestly, like coaching a lot of kids, young athletes, developing athletes, that's a great pathway to become a very, very high quality coach.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. My name is James Grigson, and I am joined here today by Calin Butterfield, the high performance manager for the United States ski and snowboard. A bit of an international flavor. We don't get many of those often, so it's your Wednesday afternoon. Calin, thank you for joining. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, James, for being here. This is a great opportunity to jump on your podcast and have a great conversation.
So the state of the world is very different, and I would consider, if you think about the sports in the world that are popular, I tend to sort of go straight towards football or soccer, as you guys call it, and some people down here call it as well. It's a sport that's played in the northern and some southern hemispheres. It's a truly global game. I would sort of, despite the fact that down here in the southern hemisphere we do ski, and there are skiers down here in New Zealand, and there are places to ski in the southern hemisphere, I would primarily say that skiing is a northern hemisphere sport, and is relatively niche to that region. Now, that sort of I'm fascinated by what I would term niche sports. Obviously not niche for you and your region. We have one down here, AFL. There's a lot of innovation and sports science that happens within our game. But I'm curious for you, sort of in your role working with skiers, the main focuses that you have there as a high performance manager from a purely physical perspective. So your day-to-day operations with the athletes, what are the key, things like injury flags that you're looking for, or key performance indicators where you go, no, we must have these sort of benchmarks for our athletes?
Yeah, my role is kind of interesting in that I work across different verticals, as we call them, but on the elite, like national team side, what I primarily do in terms of interacting with athletes is working on their extended rehab cases. So I work closely with our sports medicine team and our data science team to kind of manage these, as you can imagine, in a sport, particularly like alpine ski racing or, snowboard, free ski, half pipe, where 40 feet in the air, the injuries that we typically get are not your average, hamstring pulls or even average ACLs. It's usually, fractures and multi-ligament damage. So a majority of my time spent with athletes is on the rehab side in terms of from a strength and conditioning standpoint. I will say probably the key, or one of the key performance indicators that we look for in our athletes, they kind of fall into different buckets. From the physical side, about the only evidence that we have internally from our athletes that points to successful rehab from injury, return to performance, or prevention is strength. So we do spend quite a bit of time on that, which is definitely simplifying the equation there. But more importantly, kind of philosophically as a department, kind of stepping back, I guess, to skiing and snowboarding as a niche sport. It is. And a lot of times these athletes are, they grow up skiing and snowboarding, and sometimes, or quite often, honestly, we find that they don't play many other sports. By the time they get to the national team, they're very good skiers, snowboarders, and not all of them are very, very good just in terms of general athleticism. And I think this is probably a trend across, most elite sports, and particularly sports where they have development academies with young athletes. But this concept of trying to dose physical education, pieces into an elite performance program. And so I kind of work with our sports medicine staff and our other athletic development coaches we all just kind of try and formulate these ideas of how we can best integrate not just the X's and O's of, power and rate of force development and hitting these numbers, so to speak, or criteria for return to snow or return to performance, but really brainstorming how we can reintroduce or introduce, fundamental skill acquisition into both injured and uninjured athletes programs, because quite honestly, a lot of times that's just completely missed as they're coming up through the ranks of ski racing.
That's fascinating, because when I listened to Troy Taylor, one of your peers there at US Ski and Snowboard, speak, a lot of his conversations, and obviously it's role specific, but he sort of speaks a lot about the coaching element of high performance, and there are, I think, it's often sport specific and people specific, but I'd say largely missed when you compare it to what I've heard from Troy. So Troy is seemingly very, very focused on the people and the coaching and the education of the people and the frameworks within the staff interactions that you guys have there as a staffing unit, and then how you then flow that down to communicating to your athletes. And it seems very education and coaching driven. Mm-hmm. Of course, with the backbone of fundamental sports science principles and making sure that your athletes are getting the X's and O's that you referred to. So I'm wondering, sort of from your perspective, do you find, that's just been my observation from the US ski team and snowboard team. It's sounding like from what you've said that is a large part of what you do. It is that education of your athletes. It's that true coaching of the athletes, and it's more about intertwining the X's and O's in with the skill acquisition or the actual, the technique of the sport, as opposed to your role is, completely just sports science, strength conditioning based. That sort of like, I guess when you think about your college gyms where they just walk in, they do their training and then they get out, and that's what your job is. It's like, that's completely not what you guys are. Do you care to elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, I'm actually glad to hear that that's kind of how Troy pitched it as well. I think we're saying, similar things. And so like, just so you kind of understand, so Troy is our high performance director, right? Oversees everything. I work under him and work on a few other different kind of external projects. But yeah, I would say, to elaborate on that, we philosophically, really do believe in, the coach, and whether that's coach meaning sports psychologist, a sports scientist, PT, AT, or, physiotherapist, strength and conditioning coaches, or teachers. And so, with the skill acquisition piece, it's all about how we're designing the environments, constraining the environments, focusing the athlete's attention, having, setting good target objectives or target outcomes, like all kind of those fundamental pedagogical things. And so I think for me, what I have been really lucky is to work with a staff who's like-minded, and particularly a sports medicine staff who is of the same, thought process that really we're teaching these athletes. And it's rare, I would say, maybe not as much anymore, but to find like sports medicine professionals who, just align so and dovetail so directly with strength and conditioning coaches. But I guess more specifically to kind of elaborate, a lot of what we're doing in the rehab space, and I think this is becoming more common. And I say rehab, I'm not a rehab professional, but I work on that end of the strength and conditioning continuum, is thinking critically about, okay, instead of me just setting these tasks, okay, we're going to, let's say they're late stage, they haven't returned to snow, but they're in the performance training phases, instead of just jumping and we're going to do some cleans and some squats and then we're going to do some upper body or whatever, it's really what we're trying to do a better job of, to Troy's point, is thinking about these tasks that I'm selecting, might be fundamental from a physiological perspective. We need to develop strength and power. How can I, as a coach, prescribe this task or set this task in an environment that has a learning component? So instead of me having to over coach this athlete on, how to perform a clean or, jack their second pull or squat harder or, stand up faster, how can we provide external or environmental or task constraints that, create some self-organization? And I think what Troy is probably speaking to a bit more, because he has 2 feet in, 1 foot in the high performance department, and he works extensively with our sport coaches, is how can we all kind of have this shared philosophy of, you know, the coaching aspect, whether it's athletic development, on-hill training, all of that stuff, is really kind of the same in terms of the fundamentals, like you said, the fundamental concepts of coaching or teaching. And we're not there yet, I would say, across the board. And even more so, we're trying to spread that message out through, you know, our development system and across the country. I don't know if that kind of answers or touches on the question.
No, it certainly does. And I think when people go to university or college, they learn about the X's and O's, the physiology of exercise. They learn about the movements. They learn about, you know, sometimes they might learn about coaching, but more from just a cue perspective, you know, how to coach a squat as an example. But then as you get out into the real world and you're starting to work with teams, and I understand, you know, the sports that you're working with are very technique focused, but I would say that there are still sort of less technical sports that adopt that model of we're not just coaching a skill or a component of what this athlete does. There's one message from the top, and seemingly, and that's what we're going to push through from our high performance department to our sports psychology department to our coaching department. There's sort of going to be a one message sweep across all of our areas, and obviously you've got your niche people in there to sort of play with it, as opposed to, all right, you come into the weight room and you're just learning about, you know, you're just thinking about weights, and then you go into the rehab room and you're just doing rehab, and you go to do sports psych and you're just thinking about sports psych. There's no integration, and you mentioned, you know, an integrated model there. I'm interested though, from your perspective, was that something that then you were taught by the organization when you came in? Hey, this is how we do things, or was this something that you had done some further research on, or further study on, or is that what was taught to you during university or college? I guess it's a new skill that people learn once they get into the industry. How was that learning period for you? Because you basically had to get shunted into this thing, assumably, and then you had to get on and adopt it. So how'd you go about that?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question and story, I think. I guess I'll start with, you know, most of us, at least in this country, and I think that it's probably similar in Australia and the UK, like if you're in exercise and sports science or kines or, you know, whatever aspect pre-physical therapy, you're not really educated as a physical educator. You know, that's kind of here, you know, that's the gym teacher education, which is unfortunately dying. And, you know, I was lucky when I first came on board to work with Vern Gambetta pretty closely, who was a kind of a consultant who we had on the high performance retainer kind of payroll for a few years. And, you know, it really opened my brain up. So my background as an athlete, I was a soccer player growing up, football player, sorry. And I know that joke never gets old, right?
Never.
So I played that primarily. And then I got into weightlifting in college or just after college, which, you know, weightlifting as a sport is very, you know, X's and O's driven. Your training is your testing, is your competition, is your practice, like everything on the platform is all of that. And so my mindset traditionally was, you know, a lot of prescription, a lot of X's and O's. I would say I wasn't a bad coach, but I definitely I kind of was on one end of the continuum where I had this mindset of, if it doesn't look perfect, we need to coach this athlete so it looks perfect. I think some of that came out of the weightlifting side. Some of it came out of some other earlier influences. When I got to the ski team, I had kind of started to question that a little bit more, just from growing as a professional and having more experience and seeing like, oh, there's this narrow trough that I'm trying to force all these athletes in, and it's not being successful. It's not working. So that had started a process already internally of questioning, being kind of your archetypal university student who now had 5-6 years of experience. You know, this whole concept of like, really what people need is to learn how to learn, or athletes especially, you know, we need to be good teachers. I hadn't had that really academically given to me as a concept throughout my entire education. And so I came in with this, you know, openness, I think, because I was starting to come across this idea that, okay, what I'm doing and trying to fit all these athletes into this groove is not working. Then I was influenced by Vern and got to spend a lot of time with him, as well as some other, you know, really great skill acquisition scientists and experts who the ski team happened to be working with. So I get to the ski team, and I think, the growth for me really came in, I was given the freedom to start self-educating on it. And I think, not to make the concept overly complex, but, quite honestly, all of the elite sport coaches and strength and conditioning coaches, through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s were really like, they had physical education or coaching degrees. So to them, pedagogy was, that's just what they learned. Like they learned how to teach. And that's kind of, I think, why it's a new thing in our industry, and there's people who have now taken that and just moved it to the next level, obviously. But I think it's really an old thing. It's coaches learning how to think like teachers versus think like practitioners. And so the way at the ski team, I was really lucky to come into a staff who was already like that. We had a former strength and conditioning coach who was also a physical therapist, who was very much a, fundamental teaching. Athletes need to be learning. It's not necessarily about all the load and the performance at first. And so that just kind of, set a bit of the tone of the culture. And I would say, we have actually a few people on staff now who were educated as physical educators, like came through school as physical education majors. And now we're all speaking this same language, which I think, not to drone on too long, but I think we take for granted sometimes that it's, like you and I talk about this, it's going on in a lot of high performance departments and teams, this concept of, how to build an effective lesson plan from an athletic perspective. But it's missed in a lot of, fundamental or development level programs or elite level programs. And I think where we're at now is, this pendulum is starting to swing into this physical education, athletes as learners, coaches as teachers, or practitioners as teachers. And I think we'll settle, in the middle of, yes, we understand this sound physical education concepts are really important and critical, but I think now what we need to start focusing on is, how are we actually applying these strategies in an effective environment? And so the last thing I'll say, what's really interesting to me and where I think we have the most room for growth in a sport context, whether it's, AFL, it's American football, it's ski racing, it's soccer, a lot of the literature around pedagogy and skill acquisition is around sports skills. There's not as much around fundamental movement skills. There's very few models that are really focused on just developing the human movement system, or, educating the human movement system sans sport or sport agnostic. A lot of them are really founded on fundamental movement skills early. And then we get into some more, technically adaptive training of the sport skills. And then it's sport specific. There's nothing really for strength and conditioning that's, for lack of a better term, strength and conditioning that is, like the manual on strength and conditioning and physical education. I shouldn't say there's nothing. I probably just haven't heard of it. But I think where we have a lot of room to grow as an industry and as an organization is for S&C coaches to really take the ownership, and how can we fit physical education concepts into our strength and conditioning that's agnostic from any sort of sports skill.
And it's interesting you mentioned sort of like what's old is new, and I think it's always, whether it's, cultural references or training principles or whatever it may be. I love when sort of the retro thing comes back.
Yeah, it always comes back.
The thing about it though is it's, well, I was going to say it's so hard to achieve, and I was going to correct myself, but I'll double down, because to get everyone singing off the same hymn sheet doesn't matter if it's in a coaching environment or not, is very difficult to do. So that integrated approach is a tough thing to do, and I think maybe that's why it's almost somewhat easier to just come into the room, and just do your lifts, and then move into the other room and do your other thing, and then there'll be somebody at the very end that's trying to tie it together. So yeah. No, that's a fascinating conversation, and I hope that, well, it looks like that's what the ski team is doing. You said there's a long way to go, but just from the outside looking in, it looks like that's what the crew there are trying to achieve. So best of luck with that. I wanted to talk to you about the time that you had at EXOS. So for those, sort of a lot of our listeners are sort of more based around the Southern Hemisphere. If you don't mind explaining what EXOS is, you'll probably do a better job than I can. And then filling us in a bit more on your role at EXOS and sort of what you did there and sort of your career progression in there and then out.
Yeah. I'll make it as brief as I can. So yeah, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure most probably people in the industry know at least who they are. Yeah. When I did EXOS, so my first introduction was as an intern with Athletes Performance, which is what EXOS was called before EXOS. And then I subsequently got hired and worked there for about 7 years. And so I actually was pretty fortunate. EXOS was a great company to work for, particularly as a young coach. So I had a lot of opportunity to kind of jump around and taste different areas of the performance field. And so I started, kind of everyone's, to your point, James, like everyone's dream of working in elite sport. And I started working at the facility when they built it in Dallas. And so it was a lot of like major minor league baseball, some football, a lot of youth sports. And then from there, I actually got recruited by some other employees at EXOS that I had interned under to go work with the Special Forces, which I did for about 18 months, kind of on site in a military, live it, breathe it, taste it, eat it. Like we would go and get lunch at the chow hall, and that's what they call the lunchroom, the chow hall. Nice. So I was there for about 18 months, which is, if you can imagine, like I had gotten hired right out of college, my undergrad, and, to my dream job working in elite sport in the private sector. So I guess I'll take a step back 15 seconds. Like EXOS is private training, so it's all for money. Like athletes come in their off season and pay the company. And, there's specialist coaches that work with the NFL group or the NHL hockey group, things like that.
And just sorry to interrupt. And how difficult is it to obtain that internship? Like is EXOS an environment where they have a lot of these interns, or are they very specialized with these intern or graduate programs, as you called it?
Yeah. I mean, I think when I applied, I put everything into that application process. I think being an intern coordinator there too, for a couple of terms, like there was a pretty good pool of candidates. Now it's gone so big. It's not just this one internship I don't work for the company anymore, so I couldn't speak to it explicitly. Yeah. They have so many different facets. They have, I'm sure, like wellness internships or, corporate fitness type stuff, as well as the elite performance internships. But I think it's still, from an industry perspective, I would still recommend it to any, new coach coming out of school, because you definitely get a ton of hands-on time coaching and you get to learn from some excellent practitioners. I think I was pretty lucky. Like I got through the rounds. I knew some people as well within the community already, so they were able to put in a good word for me. But anyway, yeah. So making the transition from elite sport, so to speak, to tactical, as they call it now, or military, was quite different, especially as a young coach. And there's, that's a whole other podcast to talk about lessons there. But, the population is just so different. But in a lot of ways, it's still athletic development, performance. It's just a different population. So I was there for about 18 months. And then I actually went back to the elite side for a while before transitioning into corporate at Adidas. So I was doing some corporate fitness at Adidas, which was also great, a learning experience. And then ultimately my path out I realized that the corporate fitness realm wasn't necessarily the best fit for me at that time. I still felt I had a lot that I wanted to learn and give in the elite sport. So again, EXOS was gracious enough to grant me yet another move back into kind of the API or the elite business, where I went to work on site at the Mayo Clinic in downtown Minneapolis, sports medicine and EXOS performance partnership. And so that kind of brings me up to the time right before I ended up leaving for the ski team. And I think along the way, the best thing and I guess this is maybe advice or just reflection, but the biggest thing for me, I think, that I take away from that, and, working a job, there's always going to be issues that come up that you're unhappy about, or that, feels like a grind. But quite honestly, like, I think the opportunity within that company, and they're not the only company that would do this, but to allow you to take on new challenges, to try different things, to experience all these other pieces of the business, of the industry, is really valuable, not only in figuring out what you don't want to do, but I think it allows you, 5 years looking back or 10 years looking back, you're drawing on all these different experiences. And quite honestly, like where we're at now, again, without droning on too long, when I was working for EXOS, I'd skied my entire life just as a recreational person. I didn't even know that the U.S. ski team had like a high performance department, which is stupid because I mean they're one of the oldest high performance integrated departments in America or in the U.S. And so when I started applying for the job, it was kind of like this bright spot, I guess. Like, oh, I can put this passion that I have for activity that I've had for or been doing since I was a little kid with high performance. And I think my point is that came through a network that I had just ended up creating, of other people, and it fell in my lap, and I wouldn't have probably been in this position because I wouldn't have actively sought it out. And so taking those risks throughout your career, I think, is worth it. But then looking at it now as a 34, 35-year-old in July, it's like I probably wouldn't be as risk taking now, just because there's I have a wife, and she has a career and all this stuff, right? So doing it when I was young and really figuring it out and navigating those waters was really beneficial for me, and I'm really just pretty fortunate.
I'm interested in your diversity, like you spoke about, and EXOS was obviously a nice breeding ground for that diversity as a coach. You mentioned the amount of sports that are being played there, and then the opportunities to start working with corporate, opportunities to work with tactical. If you weren't in an EXOS environment, and I guess this sort of will dovetail into my next question, but for younger coaches or people in the industry growing up that want to work with elite athletes or athletes in general, seemingly as a younger coach, getting to taste those different environments seems to be incredibly important. And you've sort of mentioned that diversity helps. And then where most people are at in their 20s with their life is something, it's a time where you can be quite flexible and be willing to jump around from different role to different role, and sometimes different country to different country if you're lucky. And I've heard a few stories of people through EXOS being able to travel as well. If you weren't in an EXOS environment, would you advise or encourage to work in those different sports to build those skills? Is that something that you sort of see as, if you were to do it all again, that you would really prioritize differentiation in your environments that you're working in?
Yeah, I mean, a simple answer is yeah, absolutely. I think you actually bring up an interesting point, though, because like one of the things when you're early on in your career, and I think I've been detached from being early on in my career for a couple of years now, so I don't know what the landscape is currently exactly, but I can tell you from, us hiring new coaches or our internship process, I think there's pressure on young coaches, and it's probably worse. This is my opinion, or at least viewpoint. It's probably worse in Australia than it is here. Like, I don't know exactly from a university system, but if you don't have a master's or even a PhD, it's probably really hard to find a foothold in your career. Here, master's is becoming pretty much necessary. I don't have a master's. I have a bachelor's degree and then experience. But to, I guess, address your point directly, it's an interesting conversation that we have internally all the time. The diversity is important, but there is a point to, if you're always just volunteering and offering up your time for free just to get the experience, you have to balance that too, because you're not worthless even as an entry-level person. And I think as an industry, we have abused young green coaches who need experience to get the foothold, because like somebody's going to do it, somebody's going to work for free. Somebody's going to volunteer as a strength and conditioning coach in sometimes horrendous, environments, 16-hour days or whatever it is. And those are probably less common than the average. But I think, to me, diversity to a point is really good. The conversation that we have internally is, if you're on your 4th, 5th, 6th internship, you're very diverse. You've been in a lot of different environments, but at what point, is now the just experiencing a professional, whether it's, in strength and conditioning or not. Like, if we have intern applicants who are in their maybe mid-20s, who have had 6, 7 internships, but no real formal job, like professional work experience, even if it's for 6 months or a year, that's a lot different than someone who maybe hasn't even really had a whole lot of professional experience in our field. They've done maybe an internship, but then they, luck was against them and they had to find a job working as an assistant manager at Target or something, right?
Right.
That, to me, is also actually a really valuable thing, because, and I would say as a don't get disheartened if there's no jobs out there. Professional experience is going to help you in the strength and conditioning field. Now, you do have to have the fundamental knowledge and skills and behaviors and abilities, in terms of being a performance coach or being a sports scientist. But I think don't sell yourself out, or, take a role just because it's free, that's just going to beat you up, and it might provide you another kind of check on the resume, or some more experience, when there might be an opportunity out there. For example, like you, James, in the sports science fusion sport, probably came out of not necessarily nowhere, but it's not what you envisioned yourself necessarily doing. And me too, I said, I'm going to be a coach for the rest of my life. I'm going to be a master coach and be literally just a coach for the next 30, 35 years and become really, really good at it. And then this, a different opportunity presented itself, and all of a sudden I'm kind of less a coach and more a manager of programs. And I was really afraid to step into that role. But what I will say is, similarly, if you're really want to be a coach, there's no roles out there. There's a job opportunity that can support you, pay for your food, pay for your rent, get you from sleeping on someone's couch. That's something to consider too, because you're going to learn something from any role or experience you have. And quite honestly, the last thing I'll say is, I think coming into the workforce and just having a solid understanding of maybe not high performance sport necessarily, but having an understanding of work ethic and what it means to be a professional is really valuable. I guess here's the last thing I'll say. Diversity to a point is good, but if you look at certain, it's really hard for me to see how diversity and diversifying would be good if you're trying to get into European soccer, right? Or work in high performance in a sport that's very kind of traditional. I think to a point diversity is good, but like, if you've never worked in soccer before, but you have all this diverse background, it's probably going to be harder for you to find a role in professional football than, someone who has spent their entire academic and professional career in it. So
fair point. If you were to do it all again, sort of, would you do anything differently? And I'll add on to that, with that thought and in mind, what sort of advice would you have for younger people coming out of their degrees, or maybe if you want to change it down a different tack, what advice would you have for a coach who's been a coach who now has to go into that sort of managerial role and might be a little scared as you were? So I guess the thought is, people transitioning, whether they're transitioning out of college or university into the professional field for the first time, what should they be doing or thinking about? What advice would you have, or what advice would you have for people transitioning from that coach environment to now a more of a managerial environment?
Yeah. I'll take the second part first, because that's more relevant for me right now. I would say, moving from a coach to management role, I think a lot of times we see as that's the necessary next step, if we're trying to build our career. And oftentimes, honestly, it is. I think, though, be tactical in the role that you take, as far as if you still really love coaching and you still want to coach, and you're only looking at, taking on a management or a director role because that just seems like, the next step that you need to take. I think just be really critical of that choice, in the sense of find the right fit. Don't necessarily just take the next job because it's, a manager job, because the roles are different. At the same time, and on the other side of things, don't be afraid to step into a management role, because honestly, it's just coaching. It's just you're spending a lot more time coaching yourself and coaching a team of other people than you are with your athletes. And it's really a great learning experience. And I would say it has helped me be a better coach from the intrapersonal and interpersonal side. But I think my one thing too, for I probably have more than one thing, but one thing I can think of for the, emerging professional, first, don't listen to too much advice from a whole bunch of other people. I think trusting yourself and making your own decision and setting your waypoint and following it is really important. I don't think I have great advice, because I think I was such a head down. I had my vision and goal through college was I want to work for Athletes Performance, or EXOS. I want to work in soccer. I'm going to pursue this with everything. And I happened to get lucky and, know the right people and get a job there. I didn't end up working with professional soccer, but the one regret I have, I think, about my collegiate years and early professional career, I guess, is not, considering other fields even. I basically was so intrigued by the human system and the human body, which I fell into something that I ultimately am very interested in love. But I think I had a lot of influencers who were also in that space, and it kind of created a vacuum chamber, for better or for worse. And so that doesn't help people who have just gotten their degree and are coming out and like, okay, now I realize I don't want to do this or whatever. But I would say be open to, taking non-traditional paths or non-traditional roles that, maybe you can't see the direct connection. Maybe you want to be an elite sport, but honestly, like coaching a lot of kids, young athletes, developing athletes, that's a great pathway to become a very, very high quality coach, high level coach that eventually will, be recognized and opportunities will open up. If there's one thing I look for from a hiring standpoint, if you can manage groups of young athletes, develop young athletes that are robust, resilient, have good character, things like that, that to me is worth its weight in gold, because that's a hard group to work with, and it's an underappreciated group. And so I think that's a great way to, kind of get your coaching voice developed, develop your skill set, and have a lot of fun too. So I wouldn't be, if your goal, I guess I'll summarize that. If your goal is to work in elite sport, starting at those younger levels, which in and of itself can be elite, that's a really good starting point. And usually those jobs are a bit more accessible.
I was going to say so many different things, but I will just say thank you. Thank you for coming on, Mr. Butterfield. I loved having you on. I loved having the different perspective. Like I said, normally we do interview people from down here. So you've almost inspired me to start talking to more people in the Northern Hemisphere. And the sport that you're working in, the journey that you've had is fascinating. So I really appreciate you coming on, and we've gone for, that 30 minutes has just flown by. So
I warned you.
I'm guilty of it as well. I typically say to people, oh yeah, we'll talk for 20 minutes. It ends up being 40 or 45. So thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. If you enjoyed this and you want to watch some more, you can subscribe by clicking down here. If you want to watch the last interview I did, you can click up here. For Calin and James, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.